All right, this is going to be the first video for the chapter about psychotherapy and psychological interventions. Unfortunately, I misplaced my tripod today, so I'm not set up in my usual spot. Hopefully the clutter won't be too distracting. I'm hoping I can put the words up on my window there. Hopefully it'll work out. I'm sure it'll work out. All right, so in this particular chapter, we're going to talk about the various treatments that are available to deal with the psychological disorders that we talked about in the previous chapter, and just general problems that someone may experience. So the first thing that, one of the first things that the book goes into, and that my students will have to know a little bit about for the test, is just some of the basic history and improvements overall in the treatment of psychological disorders that we've seen over time. If you go back to the Middle Ages, right? Go back to the Middle Ages, all the way up through 17th century. So 17th century, what years we're talking about there? I know I get mixed up all the time. It's okay. I'm just reminding you. We're talking about 1600s there. Okay. So the disorders and their symptoms, they were largely explained by supernatural phenomena, like someone was possessed by demons. It was a result of witchcraft. There wasn't a lot of good of a scientific or medical understanding of these disorders that we've talked about. So many of the things that we might consider treatments, or what passed as treatments at the time, they were cruel and inhumane, and they were more like punishment. Punishment to get rid of the demons, punishment for engaging in witchcraft, that sort of thing. So they were not very humane treatments. Now, in the 18th century, 1700s, in Europe, we had these things called asylums. Asylums were these mental institutions that, if you would look at the ones existing at the time, they looked a whole lot like prisons for people with psychological disorders. They were not humane. They were overcrowded. Again, we hadn't really made scientific advances, so that the treatments that were available were often cruel or ineffective, or both. And so there was a movement in the 20th century, the 1900s. So in the 1900s, there was this big movement called deinstitutionalization. With deinstitutionalization, the goal was to get people with psychological disorders, to get them out of institutions and back into the community, reintegrated into the community. It was done with good intentions, and it was inspired by advances in psychopharmacology, which I will talk about in a future video too, but basically treating psychological disorders with medication. That gave people a lot of hope that we could effectively reduce particular symptoms with these medications. There were problems with deinstitutionalization, because for it to have been effective, you would have had to have more community mental health programs set up so that people could follow up and do outpatient treatment. Instead of inpatient is what we call it when you're like in a hospital, you live there. Outpatient is like you live at your home, but you go to a doctor's visit sort of thing. They didn't really set up enough community mental health services and programs and outpatient facilities. So what happened is a lot of people were no longer in institutions, but then they ended up in other less desirable situations, like becoming homeless or ending up in the prison population. Because unfortunately, a lot of times in certain situations, certain types of mental illness symptoms, when they're exhibited in the public, the police are called and it's treated as unruly behavior. I know when I worked at a psychiatric hospital, it was pretty common for someone, we get a call from county jail, or we don't have counties, we have parishes where I live, but we get a call from the jail, and they're like, hey, we got somebody, I think they belong with y'all. They seem like they might be mentally ill in some way. And so we had a few folks that originally they were picked up by the police, they were charged with something, and then they decided they'd be better suited to stay in our facility, if they had the right insurance and stuff like that. So unfortunately, deinstitutionalization, it did lead to an increased rate of homelessness and higher prison populations, which was not its intent. Now, are things better now? Well, they're not perfect. You're probably familiar with that notion, but they are better in some ways. People generally don't live in institutions long term. Some people in severe cases do, but we do have more emphasis on people being more integrated in the community. One thing to be familiar with is the different types of treatment that are available. So I mentioned you have inpatient treatment, where it's like a hospital stay. You're staying in a hospital for typically an episode that hopefully is going to get better and you get to go home. Some people have residential treatment where they live more long term in a facility, but also with the intention that they're going to be discharged home someday or to a home of some sort. And then partial hospitalization. Sometimes people are in the hospital for part of the day, but they get to leave at some point. Like maybe they sleep at home, or they might even be able to go to a job during the day and return to the hospital. And then you have outpatient treatment. That's like when you're going for therapy sessions, counseling sessions. You go and visit a clinical setting, but you were living at home. And then the book also mentions intensive outpatient treatment. But for my students, for my class, for the test, just know the difference between inpatient and outpatient. All right, now in the next video, I am going to talk about general schools of thought, different approaches, different general approaches to psychotherapy. The traditional stuff we think of when we think of therapy, talking therapy, talking cure type of stuff.